What if I told you that some of the most famous stories you learned in school never happened the way they were told? I'm not talking about crazy theories or internet conspiracies. I'm talking about episodes that are in textbooks, repeated for generations, and that carry early warning signs of simplification, romanticization, and even distortion. The apple that supposedly hit Newton on the head, Paul Revere's dramatic scream, the Old West full of daily shootouts. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The problem isn't just the historical error. The problem is what it does to your mind. When you grow up absorbing simplified versions, you learn to accept ready-made narratives without questioning. And this generates initial symptoms of automatic thinking. These are silent symptoms of an upbringing that values memorable stories over real processes. Don't ignore these bodily signals when something seems excessively perfect, neat, too convenient. Often these are signs that your body is telling you that context is lacking. The truth is uncomfortable. Lone heroes sell better than collective lawsuits. Memorable phrases stick more than complex negotiations. But the warning signs are there for those who want to see them. Small, hidden symptoms appear when a narrative fits perfectly into a moral script. And it is precisely these symptoms that you shouldn't ignore that indicate that perhaps you have learned an overly polished version of the past. Today you're going to discover historical events that never happened the way you were taught, and understand why these versions keep being repeated. And more importantly, you're going to learn to identify the silent signs that reveal when a story is more interested in stirring emotions than informing. Stay with me until the end, because after this video, you'll never hear an official story the same way again. The apple that never bonked Newton. He grew up hearing the story of the apple falling on Newton's head, as if the universe had given a literal touch to reveal gravity. But there's no evidence that the fruit actually hit him. What happened was observation, reflection, and the connection of ideas. The simplified story became a symbol, but also one of the early warning signs of how comfortable narratives replace complex facts. These are initial symptoms of an education that prefers memorable images to the real process. Don't ignore these body signals when something seems too good to be entirely true. He understands that scientific discovery rarely happens like a theatrical flash of lightning. They are silent symptoms of curiosity accumulated over time. Newton was already studying motion and mathematics deeply before the famous apple. The falling fruit was, at most, a trigger for thought. Small, hidden symptoms of doubt and critical observation are what truly drive science. Don't ignore the signals your body is giving you when a story seems oversimplified. Often, it has been adapted to fit into children's books. Want to apply this to life? When you hear an inspiring story, go beyond the popular version. Read more complete biographies, such as Richard Westfall's Never at Rest about Newton. Watch for warning signs that indicate excessive romanticization. These are symptoms you shouldn't ignore because they show where the narrative was shaped to evoke emotion, not to inform. He realizes that questioning myths doesn't destroy inspiration, it strengthens understanding. And when someone starts deconstructing such an iconic story, they begin to realize that other official versions may also need revision. Columbus, proving the earth was round. He learned in school that Christopher Columbus sailed to prove the earth was round, as if everyone before him believed in a flat planet. But that's not true. Long before Columbus, scholars like Aristotle and Eratosthenes were already discussing and even calculating the Earth's circumference with impressive precision. The popular version has become one of the early warning signs of how we simplify history to create solitary heroes. These are initial symptoms of a narrative that transforms collective processes into individual achievements. Don't ignore these body language signals when something sounds like genius against the world. He understands that Columbus was seeking a new trade route to Asia, not proving the shape of the planet. The real debate was about the size of the Earth, not its shape. Small, silent symptoms of distortion appear when history becomes a simplified moral tale. These are hidden symptoms that reveal how societies construct myths to teach easy lessons. Don't ignore the signals your body is giving you when a narrative portrays a character as the only enlightened one surrounded by general ignorance. This almost never corresponds to historical reality. Want to apply this reasoning? Whenever you find a story with a one-against-all structure, investigate further. Read different sources, compare versions. Seek out authors like Felipe Fernandez Armesto, who explore the real context of the voyages of discovery. Observe the warning signs that indicate dramatic exaggeration. These are symptoms you shouldn't ignore because they show where the story was shaped to fit into textbooks. He realizes that dismantling myths isn't about disrespecting the past. It's about understanding how narratives shape perceptions. And when someone starts to see that, they begin to question other historical scenarios that seem straight out of movies. Columbus proving the Earth was round. He learned in school that Christopher Columbus sailed to prove the Earth was round, as if everyone before him believed in a flat planet. But that's not true. Long before Columbus, scholars like Aristotle and Eratosthenes were already discussing and even calculating the Earth's circumference with impressive precision. The popular version has become one of the early warning signs of how we simplify history to create solitary heroes. These are initial symptoms of a narrative that transforms collective processes into individual achievements. Don't ignore these body language signals when something sounds like genius against the world. He understands that Columbus was seeking a new trade route to Asia, not proving the shape of the planet. The real debate was about the size of the Earth, not its shape. Small, silent symptoms of distortion appear when history becomes a simplified moral tale. These are hidden symptoms that reveal how societies construct myths to teach easy lessons. Don't ignore the signals your body is giving you when a narrative portrays a character as the only enlightened one, surrounded by general ignorance. This almost never corresponds to historical reality. Want to apply this reasoning? Whenever you find a story with a one-against-all structure, investigate further. Read different sources, compare versions. Seek out authors like Felipe Fernandez Armesto, who explore the real context of the voyages of discovery. Observe the warning signs that indicate dramatic exaggeration. These are symptoms you shouldn't ignore because they show where the story was shaped to fit into textbooks. He realizes that dismantling myths isn't about disrespecting the past. It's about understanding how narratives shape perceptions. And when someone starts to see that, they begin to question other historical scenarios that seem straight out of movies. King John willingly signed the Magna Carta. He learned that King John signed the Magna Carta as a noble gesture, almost as if he had woken up feeling generous that morning in 1215. But the truth is far less romantic. The document was signed under intense pressure from rebellious barons, with the king practically cornered. The voluntary version is one of the early warning signs of how history likes to soften conflicts. These are initial symptoms of a diplomatic narrative that hides real political tension. Don't ignore these body language signals when a historical decision seems excessively elegant. He understands that the Magna Carta was the result of financial crisis, military defeats, and widespread discontent. It wasn't an act of kindness, it was forced calculation. Small, silent symptoms appear when books transform coercion into conciliation. These are hidden symptoms of didactic adaptation. History is molded to appear more organized than it actually was. Don't ignore the signals your body is giving you when something seems too clean in a context that should be turbulent. Want to apply this critical lens? Whenever you study a historical treaty or agreement, ask yourself, who really had the power, who was pressuring whom. Read analyses like Dan Jones's on medieval England. Observe the warning signs that indicate the romanticization of authority figures. These are symptoms you shouldn't ignore because they show how conflicts are softened over time. He realizes that many historical signings were less about celebration and more about survival. And when someone starts to see that, they begin to distrust even famous historical phrases that may never have been said. Paul Revere's famous shout that never happened. He grew up hearing that Paul Revere rode through the night shouting, "The British are coming," as if it were a perfectly scripted movie scene. But in practice, that would have been unlikely. Many colonists still considered themselves British. The famous phrase is one of the early warning signs of how poetry shapes historical memory. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem helped solidify the heroic image, but not as a literal record. These are early symptoms of when literature becomes a document. Don't ignore these bodily signals when a quote seems too convenient. He understands that the warning was discreet, strategic, and probably said in a low tone to avoid scrutiny. Small, silent symptoms of exaggeration appear when historical phrases are repeated without a reliable primary source. These are hidden symptoms of nationalist construction, where heroes need memorable phrases. Don't ignore the signals your body is giving you when you realize a story seems tailor-made to inspire patriotism. Often, that's exactly what happened. Want to apply this? Whenever you hear a famous historical quote, look for the original source. Ask yourself, was it documented at the time or did it emerge decades later? Observe the warning signs that indicate later reconstruction. These are symptoms you shouldn't ignore because they reveal how collective identity is built with symbolic narrative. He realizes that questioning famous phrases doesn't diminish the historical achievement, it only removes the dramatic veneer. And when someone starts to realize this, they understand that even great historical protests may have been motivated by more complex reasons than the book summarizes. The Boston Tea Party's tax grievance. He learned that the Boston Tea Party happened because the colonists were furious about abusive taxes on tea. It seems simple, almost didactic. High taxes breed revolt. But the truth is more complex. The tax on tea at that time was relatively low. The problem involved commercial monopoly and political control. This simplified version is one of the early warning signs of how stories are reduced to fit into a sentence. They are early symptoms of convenient storytelling. Don't ignore these body language signals when something seems excessively binary. He understands that the Tea Act benefited the East India Company, creating economic and symbolic tension. Small, silent symptoms of distortion appear when history becomes merely a protest against taxes. These are hidden symptoms of ideological simplification. Don't ignore the signals your body is giving you when you realize that a historical event involves more commercial interests than slogans. Politics is rarely driven by a single motive. It's usually a mix of economics, power, and public narrative. Want to apply this reading? Whenever you study a historical protest, investigate who wins and who loses economically. Read deeper analyses of the British mercantile context of the 18th century. Observe the warning signs that indicate overly linear explanations. These are symptoms you shouldn't ignore because they show where complexity has been traded for superficial clarity. He realizes that dismantling this simplified version opens his eyes to how commercial interests shape public discourse. And when someone starts to see this, they begin to question even iconic figures associated with the founding of a nation. Betsy Ross sewed the first American flag. He heard that Betsy Ross sewed the first flag of the United States, as if the identity of a nation had been born in a single sewing room. The image is powerful, almost cinematic. However, direct historical records are scarce, and the story emerged decades later, recounted by descendants. This is already one of the early warning signs of oral tradition transformed into official fact. These are initial symptoms of national symbolic construction. Don't ignore these bodily signals when a narrative appears long after the event. He understands that the creation of the flag involved multiple versions and possible designers, including Francis Hopkinson, who left documented records. Small, silent symptoms appear when a specific character is elevated to a symbol without solid documentation. These are hidden symptoms of a collective need for simple and inspiring stories. Don't ignore the signals your body is giving you when you realize that the main source is family tradition and not an official document. This doesn't mean it's impossible, but it requires caution. Want to apply this critical mindset? Whenever a story is based primarily on late accounts, ask, what is the contemporary evidence? Read historiographical analyses that challenge popular versions. Watch for warning signs that indicate retrospective romanticization. These are symptoms you shouldn't ignore because they show how myths help consolidate national identity. He realizes that symbols are important, but symbols don't replace evidence. And when someone starts questioning even the origin of such a striking symbol, they begin to look more carefully at inventions attributed to great names in history. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. He grew up believing that Thomas Edison simply invented the light bulb, as if he had woken up one bright morning, literally, and created light out of nothing. But the story is longer, more collective, and let's face it, more interesting. Before Edison, inventors like Humphrey Davy and Joseph Swan were already working on versions of electric lighting. The idea of a single enlightened genius is one of the early warning signs of oversimplification. These are initial symptoms of a narrative that prefers isolated heroes to collaborative networks. Don't ignore these body signals when an invention seems to appear out of nowhere. He understands that Edison's great merit was to perfect, commercialize, and make viable on a large scale something that had already been under development. Small, silent symptoms appear when books ignore this context and transform improvement into absolute creation. These are hidden symptoms of how culture loves to personalize progress. Don't ignore the signals your body is giving you when you realize that almost every great innovation involves previous attempts. The slight discomfort of discovering this is healthy. It's critical thinking awakening. Want to apply this perspective? Whenever you study an invention, ask yourself, who came before? Which prototypes failed? Read more comprehensive biographies, such as Edmund Morris's Edison, and compare them with records of other inventors. Observe the warning signs that indicate a lone genius narrative. These are symptoms you shouldn't ignore because they show how human progress is cumulative, not instantaneous. He realizes that dismantling this myth doesn't diminish Edison. It only reveals that innovation is the result of persistence, collaboration, and context. And when someone starts to see this in inventions, they realize that perhaps much of the history taught is more symbolic than factual. Now let me ask you a sincere question. How many of these stories have you repeated without ever stopping to question them? Notice how it's not just about Newton's apple or Paul Revere's scream. It's about how narratives are constructed. It's about how simplified versions enter books, are repeated for years, and before we know it become absolute truths. The early warning signs have always been there. Stories that are too perfect, heroes that are too isolated, phrases that are too dramatic. These are initial symptoms that something has been adjusted to sound better, not necessarily to be more accurate. And look, that doesn't mean the story is a complete lie. It means it's human. And where there are humans, there is narrative. There is simplification. There are symbols. The silent symptoms of romanticization appear when everything seems too clean, linear, and morally organized. Don't ignore these bodily signals when you feel that slight intellectual discomfort, that doubt that arises in the back of your mind. They are signs that your body is telling you it's time to investigate further. Because critical thinking doesn't begin by denying everything, it begins by asking better questions. What interests were behind that version? Who benefited from that narrative? What details were left out? These are symptoms you shouldn't ignore because they show where the surface ends and reality begins. If this video opened your eyes, even just a little, then you've already taken a huge step. And from now on, every time you hear a story that seems too perfect, you'll notice the warning signs, you'll perceive the hidden symptoms of simplification, and you'll see beyond the first layer. If you enjoyed this content, if it made you think differently, then subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. Because in the next videos, we'll continue exploring stories, myths, and truths that completely change the way you understand the past and the present. And tell me in the comments, which of these stories surprised you the most?